Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute to tonight's lecture, which is titled Poised Between the Past and Future, the Sheikh Zayed Mosque. Speaker is Robert Hillenbrand, Honorary Professor of the History of Art at the University of Edinburgh. Professor Hillenbrand is a Fellow of the British Academy and one of the world's most preeminent scholars of Islamic art and architecture. He received his education at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford and got his PhD in 1974. For many years, he held a chair in Islamic art at the Department of Fine Art of the University of Edinburgh. His international reputation is, among other things, borne out by many prestigious visiting professorships at universities of Princeton, University of California at Los Angeles, University of Bamberg in Germany, Dartmouth College, and my alma mater, Groningen in the Netherlands. He has published many books and articles in which the interrelationship of form, function, and iconography, or meaning, in Islamic architecture and painting is the central focus of his scholarship. His latest book, which in a way has already appeared, is titled The Sheikh Zayed Mosque, a Landmark of Modern Islamic Architecture. And I think it's available for a more general public later this year. It is based on this particular study of the Sheikh Zayed Mosque that this evening Professor Hillenbrand will present his findings and analysis to the broader public. And I've seen that among the broader public is also a tiny baby. Welcome. His lecture will explore how this modern and perhaps postmodern tribute to the memory of the founder of the UAE draws on diverse traditions of Islamic architecture and is another hallmark of modern state mosques. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hillenbrand.
Thank you very much for coming. I want to speak a few words of introduction and then go on to look at what a state mosque is, what the parallels are, and then take you on a tour of the mosque from its exterior to its courtyard, its ablutions, the approach to the sanctuary and the sanctuary itself, before concluding with a few words about ornament and about landscaping, and then trying to summarize the whole thing. Let me begin then with an introduction. This mosque is a magnet for visitors, and I don't need to stress that to this audience. It showcases Abu Dhabi. It crests a building boom in modern mosques. And it works at several levels, as all great buildings do. For example, it's a national symbol. It's a center for tourism. It's an architectural benchmark. It's a state mosque. And it's a memorial to its founder, Sheikh Zayed himself, who intended it to be ecumenical. Now, that's a rare thing for a mosque that speaks to many different communities and even to different faiths. And one shouldn't forget also, yet another level of meaning, the local impact, its impact on the citizens of Abu Dhabi. Again, you don't need to be reminded that there's no tradition of architecture here. So it's a risky thing to build a mosque on this scale for hundreds of millions of dollars in such a very public way. The context of it is obviously what it is in the first instance, namely, it's a Friday mosque, a mosque of assembly for the citizens of this city. But it's also, and I'll explain that in a moment, a state mosque, and that's a very particular category of mosque. And the other aspect of the context that I want to underline now is that it's a context of breakneck change. Change every 5 minutes. Once again, you live in this city, you see it happening under your very eyes. And the very rapid way in which this mosque has grown up is one example of that breakneck speed. I want to say a few words about the impact of Sheikh Zayed himself on this building. The traditional story is that he visited Casablanca in the late 1980s and was bowled over by the great new mosque that had just been built there, and determined to do something similar in his own country. The mosque at Casablanca has a matchless location by the sea. It's a wonderfully visible mosque. And by good chance, Abu Dhabi is also on the sea, and this site, a mirage across the shimmering water, is also beautifully located. And so a competition was held in the late 1980s, in fact, a series of competitions. 55 different proposals were put forward. 18 of them were shortlisted. There was competition after competition after competition. And eventually, a winning design was chosen and work began. And the timing, I think, is significant. Like many an Islamic ruler before him, he did not undertake this great mosque in his youth or even his middle age, but in his old age, as a symbol, perhaps, of how he saw his country and how he wanted to memorialize the progress that it had made in the last couple of generations. And it bears his personal stamp. The minarets are his idea. The courtyard with its flowers, the colors, the materials in which marble plays a major role, the use of water to a degree very unusual in any mosque anywhere, the use of the figure 5 in the decoration, in the architecture, pentagrams, pentangles, 5-pointed stars. His preference, instead of the normal 8 in Islamic architecture, perhaps a reference to the 5 pillars of Islam. Who knows? And finally, the idea of landscape, the notion that the mosque should be embowered in a garden, is his idea. Now, I'm not trying to say for a moment that Sheikh Zayed watched over this mosque with an eagle eye and interfered in the architecture. I'm talking about vision. And that is what he brought to the design. There are pictures of him looking at a model of the mosque. Let me now move on to the state mosque. And I guess I have to define it. Mosques have been built throughout the Islamic world from the Prophet's lifetime onwards, but they are not state mosques. And the sudden expansion in the number of buildings that could be called state mosques, that is to say, large-scale mosques located in the capital of a country, that is a development of our own times. It comes from the massive change that has overtaken the Islamic world in the last 100 years. a building boom which, look around you in this city, is modernist, full of matchbox architecture, skyscrapers, steel and concrete skeletons with windows, a huge acreage of windows, rectilinear, vertical, plain, and most uncomfortable to live in a hot climate like this, and demanding a huge amount of money in artificial air conditioning. That is what the modern world has brought throughout the Middle East. Now, obviously, no one wants to see a mosque like that. But what kind of mosque do you want? What should it look like? Should it be a pastiche? Should it be avant-garde? What is avant-garde? There have been mosques that are not recognizable as mosques because they've been built by Western architects who had no idea about what a mosque should look like. And so they looked at a couple of books and glued some Islamic motifs onto the outside of their buildings and called it a mosque. But the idea of a state mosque actually goes right back to the Umayyads. Here's the great mosque of Damascus, the Umayyad mosque, with its great gable covered in rich mosaic, early 8th century. Here, the Süleymaniye in Istanbul, a mountainous building on top of a hill, visible from afar, on the seashore, well, not far from the seashore. And so we have from the very beginning, and then in the period of the great superpowers of the Islamic world, the Mughal, the Safavid, the Ottoman empires in the 16th and 17th centuries, we have these great state mosques. But now look at the modern period. 60+ Islamic nations now. Many of them confident with new won wealth. Many of them eager to establish a national identity. They want their mosques to express not just the faith of Islam, but also a commitment to the modern world. This is not easy. It's intrinsically a tricky business. There are growing populations all across the Islamic world. These buildings have to be big. They have to be designed with an eye to the future. And then there's the constant dialogue, the polarities between the architects and the patrons. How are they going to get on? How do their rather different visions of what a great building should be, what a state mosque should be, how do they fit? Here's one in Nigeria at the top, Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia at the bottom. They don't look very much like the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque, do they? There's a difference here between borrowed knowledge and owned knowledge. Borrowed knowledge is that of modernist architects whose briefs are normally domestic or public architecture, but never religious architecture, so that they come into this sphere with discomfort. And the patron, who can't talk the language of architecture, but who may have an idea in his head about what the building should look like. And one mustn't forget either the importance of the tradition in the Arabian Peninsula, which is an anti-architectural tradition, with the glowing exception of the Yemen, there is no well-founded tradition of large public mosques in the Arabian Peninsula. So our mosque in Abu Dhabi almost develops from a standing start. It's not rooted in a deep local tradition. There's the great mosque at Casablanca, with the tallest minaret in the world. Built, are you surprised, by a Frenchman. The great mosque of Sultan Qaboos in Oman. 5 minarets this time, 1 dome instead of the 3, but with a proper understanding of the Islamic tradition. To take a single example, look at the decoration of the dome, which is a careful rethinking of the Mamluk domes of Cairo. And the same can be said for the minarets. Its network of intersecting arches also is firmly grounded in medieval Islamic practice, especially in the Maghrib, and it has a wonderful succession of niches in all kinds of traditions: Mughal, Ottoman, Safavid, Andalusian, Hijazi, and so on. So there's an example of a state mosque that really works. But when you look at that, built by a Turkish architect in Islamabad, you can sympathize with the words of a certain civil servant called Faruqi, who said when this mosque was being planned, we want a mosque that reflects the fact that we're a new nation, but an old people. The building should look native to the soil. We're unlucky. We're Pakistan. We've lost all our great buildings to the Hindus in India. Let's at least build something that we can recognize as Mughal. And they get this. So there's a built-in inconsistency between what even the chairman of the board asks for and what you finally get. So, with the honorable exception of the Sultan Qaboos Mosque, all the state mosques that I've shown you so far from the present century are not native to the soil, are not respectful of local traditions, do not have a consistent visual language. In other words, they don't know what they're doing, except spending a huge amount of money. Now, what are the requirements for a successful state mosque? It needs, number one, to be sited in the capital, where it will attract the most attention. It needs to have immense capacity, and that, all the examples I've shown you do have. Many thousands of worshippers can be accommodated there. It needs to be, this is not so obvious, on the outskirts. And why? Because it needs to be big. It needs to have a virgin site. It can't be shoehorned into a dense urban structure. That won't work. If possible, it should be landscaped, so that the city, as it expands, will enclose it, but will have a green heart. And at the heart of the heart will be the mosque itself. It needs to be visible. It needs to have easy access in this age of the motor car. It needs to speak a familiar language, but nevertheless to have innovative features. And often enough, it needs to have ancillary functions. A library, a conference hall, a lecture theatre, all kinds of other functions which have to do with education. The last of the examples is from Jakarta, Indonesia. And you could be forgiven for thinking that this is, I don't know, a government building, the Ministry of Works, rather than a mosque. No such problem with our mosque. It speaks a familiar language, a language of dome and vault and minaret that has been an Islamic language for 1400 years. Let's look at that exterior. The colossal scale, for a start, the easy visibility from all sides, the changing balance of volumes, heavy and light, in an unpredictable rhythm. The way that the corners are anchored with heavy plinths, the succession of major and minor accents on the facades, the sequence of blocks, the plainness of the whole facade. Its language of ornament is not applied ornament, but architectural articulation. Then there's the extraordinary interpenetration of the exterior and the interior. This is a mosque that is open on two sides. I haven't found a single other mosque in the world that does that. It's a masterstroke. It says, come in. It's done very simply. Open arcades, two-way visual traffic. When you're in there, you see people outside. When you're outside, you see people inside. The light changes all the time. You see there a sandy haze. But those of you who have visited it in the early morning will see it as golden. Those of you who see it in twilight will see a crepuscular gray. Those of you who see it at midnight will see it midnight blue. At noon, blinding, painful to the eyes. But at various seasons, and I've seen it at various seasons, and at various times of day, and I've seen it at various times of day, it is extraordinarily different in its coloring. Gray, yellow, blue, seen across the water, it's like a fairy tale palace sculptured out of ice. And here's another innovation, again, very unexpected, unparalleled. 10 pools surrounded on 3 sides. Large expanses of water. Well, that creates an immediate color contrast with the architecture itself, the deep blue of the water, and then the usual white of the marble. And it's more than that. This, as I don't need to remind you, is an arid land, a thirsty land, a land where water has a meaning that, to me, living in Britain, is beyond my imagination. I get too much of it, you get too little of it. What does that do? Well, on the practical level, it reflects the architecture so that you have visual surprises as you walk along. It's soothing, it's peaceful, it's a natural form of air conditioning. It's a boundary marker. Are you beginning to see that this building can't be summed up in a sentence or a paragraph? it operates at various levels. And the one level doesn't contradict the other level. There are symmetries, as you can see from this plan, this bird's eye view. The symmetries, for instance, of the halls for female prayer on either side, of the vestibules to the great sanctuary, of the ablutions, and the arcades of the courtyard. There's the Qibla Wall, and here too, this set of arcades is perfectly paralleled on the far side. What you see here is the so-called VIP chamber, an enormous soaring piece of architecture glued onto the back of the mihrab. On the outside, the entrance, which has the single big inscription of the whole mosque. Not easy to read, made, as so often happens in Islamic architecture, deliberately difficult to read. Now, why is that? It's because Muslims know the Quran so well. And if you know it too well, you recognize it like that, and your mind moves on. But if you're forced to look and look and look until you can interpret it, then something else is happening in your mind and spirit. Contemplation, spiritual contemplation, meditation. Please stop, don't hurry, take your time. The quotation is from Surah 9, verse 18, and by a factor of 4, it is the most popular verse of the Quran in all of Islamic architecture. Whether we're talking about Spain or Indonesia, this is the one at the entrance to mosques. It says that only those people should enter mosques who have behaved as good Muslims, who have paid their zakat, and so on. So it's a message, it's an encouragement, but it's also a warning. And its context, a tree of life, executed in the most delicate, crisp carving, a kind of white marble garden that envelops the writing. Organic, understated, not really botanically accurate, but who cares? This is a mosque. The arcades of the exterior, repeating endlessly a single modular unit. And clearly enough, there's a vanishing point, and the architecture, so to speak, concentrates your view into that vanishing point. What's the purpose of it? It's about infinity. Infinity is about eternity. There's a spiritual dimension to that architectural device. And as you walk along this arcade, you're aware of a constant concertina rhythm of open and closed spaces. Let me move on to the courtyard. But one last look at the reflections of this extraordinary arcade in the pools. Reflections which are intensified at the time of dusk and nighttime. And it may look to you as if these are very artificial photographs, but I assure you, you just have to go to the mosque at the right time and you will see this view. This is not some photographer's trick. One of the external arcades with a succession of tiled panels in Turkish style, in Iznik style, and I'll have something to say about these capitals and about this inlay work at a later stage. The courtyard. Again, you're conscious of the huge scale of the whole operation. Despite the intrusions into the courtyard space of the minarets, for example. It's a sun trap. This is not a place to visit at noon. It'll give you a headache. It's disorientatingly large, disorientatingly empty. A natural foil in its emptiness to the massed blocks of the architecture around it. The minarets, as you can see, are of daunting height. They're inspired by the Mamluk minarets of Cairo in their parsimonious decoration, a garnishing of gold. But they are not, or I should say one other thing about them, they light up at night and are in fact used as beacons for aircraft. And that perpetuates in modern language a very old Islamic tradition, which is that minarets in the Middle Ages had lights in the form of lanterns burning at the top of them. Caravans traveled at night, and landlocked minarets at intervals along the desert trails served as beacons, lighthouses. What does manar mean if it doesn't mean a place of light, a place of fire? So a guidance which is both practical and, of course, can be read in a spiritual light. But the glory of the courtyard is not the buildings around it, but the floor. And that's the first time I've ever seen so much made of a floor in a mosque. The Italians, who looked after the setting of it, called this the Mosque of the Flowers. And you can see why. The designs were by an English watercolor artist called Kevin Dean. But you could be forgiven for seeing the hand of Georgia O'Keeffe here. Or the hand of the anonymous, patient, meticulous, scrupulous watercolorists of Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries with their very, very careful botanical studies, of which there's an example just by way of comparison. That's the 19th century botanical study in watercolor, and that's the mosque. I'll linger on this, actually. It's the glory of the whole courtyard. To some people, the glory of the mosque. You can see it best by going, let's say, up to the first stage of any of the minarets and seeing it from above. And then the garden begins to bloom. But you can also experience it just by walking along and being spellbound by the flowers that open before your eyes. These are not earthly flowers. These are not the flowers that you have in your garden. They're not real. These are flowers of the mind, not of the garden catalogue. And once again, they have another significance. Islamic art from the time of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem onwards, has developed a vocabulary to suggest paradise. And that vocabulary is, whatever form it takes, is united by the idea that the trees, the waters, the buildings, the flowers, the plants of paradise are not those of our world. They obey different laws. And so from the selfsame stem, there sprout different leaves, different blossoms, different colors. Let's move on. The Sanctuary Facade. An architectural ensemble dominated by the three great domes, but as we look closer, we see a farrago of lesser domes, clustered like chicks around the mother hen. 32 separate domes on this courtyard facade. For my money, a little too many. But that's a matter of taste. There are certainly Abbasid, Fatimid, Ottoman parallels for this multiplication of domes over the sanctuary. And certainly it keeps the eye busy, especially these little kiosks whose function I can't begin to explain. Maybe there's a little bit too much going on. Let's move on to the ablutions. Tucked away in the corners of the courtyard, one for men, one for women, typical of the symmetry, the antiphony that operates in this mosque. Now, traditionally, the ablutions facilities were a necessary evil. They were not something to glory in. They were tucked out of sight, they were unaesthetic, they were rigorously practical. But to my mind, the ablutions facilities in this mosque are one of the jewels in its crown. They strike a note from the very moment that you enter them. Here's the first basin of quiet splendor. A green, huge green Chinese marble basin with an Ottoman-style Islamic tile frame, and then glass mosaic with gold scattered tesserae in the center. That knocks you back, I tell you. And then you enter the main ablutions chamber. Again, green Chinese marble used for the stools on which those who are washing themselves, performing wudu, sit. And at the center, this extraordinary mountainous water feature, quite unparalleled. Multi-tiered. A fountain which combines running water with still water, with subtle lighting from underneath, so that it glows. A really ambitious water feature which owes something to the development of such water features in Mughal architecture in India. And indeed, the marble of the floor is white and grey Indian marble, inlaid with an 8-pointed star, whose points you can just see here, white and grey. Whenever you want to have a rest going round the mosque, go down into the ablutions facility, and it will be cool. It will be a place of refreshment for the spirit. But as I say, the masterpiece is this central feature with its cascading flow of water, never ending. Quite entrancing. That's what it looks like from above, with these multiple lobes, each of them fed from an unseen source, and those little spots that you can see are lighting. You could write a book about the use of lighting in this mosque, and another book about the use of glass. And earlier mosques anywhere have neither of these features to any significant degree. But whoever devised the electrics of this mosque was a genius. And the electrical effects, which don't require darkness, are constantly varied. I'll give you some more examples before long. Let's move on to the approach to the sanctuary. I'm looking now at 4 separate structures, the prayer halls here and the vestibules here. And this is the sanctuary itself. The vestibules first. Spacious, plain lower walls. Once again, one of these extraordinary floors laid and polished by hand by Indian craftsmen, Makrana marble, quarried in the old-fashioned way in Rajasthan, and brought at immense expense to this site. And you can see the spreading tendrils of the plants on the floor in this image, and you can see them beginning again at springing level of the arches. You can see, too, the effect of glass. The transparent glass, tinted glass, glass mosaic, glass with a framework of bronze, as you can see in the smaller image on the screen, infill of a bronze door. All of this flooding the chamber with light. And you can see what's going on outside because, of course, the glass is transparent. And this is a good image to look at, to catch the pulsating organic rhythm of this plant decoration, which is unique to the mosque here. No straight lines. And even the marble slabs into which these plants are set, even they are curvaceous. They're not straight. They're not machine cut. Someone has really thought out the smallest detail of how this operation works. It's unreal, but it works. The balance between full and empty space, between beautiful close focus decoration and emptiness is well seized. And so to the dome of one of these vestibules, they're both the same, with its theme of 5 again, almost like Russian dolls, one within the other, as you go further and further up into the reaches of the dome. And you'll notice the absolute thicket of carved stucco, which can be seen everywhere. And even the windows are covered with carved stucco in a style which is very closely linked to that of Umayyad windows in Damascus and elsewhere in the 8th century. Remember me saying earlier that this was an ecumenical mosque? You're seeing the evidence of it. It uses the past innovatively but respectfully, and the past is drawn from every part of the Islamic world. There are Andalusian details, two-tone marble, for example. There is Indian details in the inlay work of the flowers that I've been showing you, and everything in between. A further detail of one of these vestibules, with the plants growing to form a kind of crown over the arched windows that lead to the sanctuary itself. And here one of the lateral halls for women to pray in, a Thai carpet, mustard-colored, with a design that exactly, sweetly, replicates the ceiling decoration. And you'll notice a difference between the side facing Mecca, which is deliberately calmed down, deliberately understated, and the more lavishly decorated side opposite. You'll see there a grasp of the grand design as well as a grasp of detail. We move on to the sanctuary itself, the liturgical focus of the mosque, its very heart. Let me begin by looking at spatial factors. This is of massive scale in comparison with the rest of the mosque. And the anticipation of getting there is heightened by the way that the vestibules and the central entrance way are designed. Suddenly, you're in a much larger space. It can't be experienced at a glance. It's that big. It could be if it had been differently designed, but you'll see straight away that the supports are not uniformly distributed, but grouped in clusters of 4, of 8, of 16. There are 96 of them altogether, and they're concentrated so that they carry the weight of the 3 huge domes. The ornament, as I'll show you, and I'm talking now not of the ornament there, the carved stucco ornament, but the ornament on the walls, the side walls, is not standard Islamic ornament. It's not based on the figure 8, but as I said earlier, on the figure 5. And it has a different color scheme in which gray and brown, rather than, for example, blue, takes pride of place. And yet other forms of decoration, the carpet, the 99 names of God on the Qibla Wall, are very much in standard Islamic forms of expression. So there's this balance between the new, the unexpected, and the old, the expected. The basic design features 3 ready-made adjoining octagons, of which the first one is in the foreground. They dominate the interior and have a basically Maghrebi design. I have nothing to say about the chandeliers. I've not looked into the architecture there or the design, but they are a major feature of this design. You're now looking at the Qibla Wall, the focus of prayer for the whole mosque. Notice the mihrab, which is small but superlative in design, and the minbar, still smaller. So the option of size, of immense size, which could have been taken, was not taken. That's interesting. The Qibla Wall also has a modest, reduced palette. But before we get there, let's have another look at a closer look at the columns which do the actual work of heavy lifting. And they're inlaid, as you can see, they're in groups. They're inlaid with mother-of-pearl decoration of a vegetal kind, and these long, curving tendrils which snake their way up the columns. This then is the Qibla Wall, and it contains, and this was a change in design in the course of building the mosque. The original idea was that it should have a copy of some of the earliest leaves of Hijazi Qurans of the 1st century of Islam. But that design was rejected, and instead we have the 99 beautiful names of God. all of them are visible easily. Take it from me, that's a first in Islamic architecture. The standard way in which the 99 names of God are shown is orbiting like stars in a dome. And these buildings are not meant to be seen with binoculars, but with the naked eye, and you can't see what the script says. But here, every single name can be read. That, again, is a support for worship, for contemplation, as you read the names of God, as you think about the names of God. The script is in a pastiche of 10th century Kufic. You can see Allah directly above the mihrab. And when you look closer, no, I have to do that under ornament, I think. Well, that'll do. When you look closer, you can see that they're executed, it seems, on several levels, so that there's a sculptural aspect to them. But I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Let's look at the mihrab, a masterpiece of understatement. There's no inscription at all, except the Allah above. It revives a technique not used since Mamluk times, but in a totally new way, with a muqarnas or honeycomb support for the vault of the mihrab, and then the rest of it in these extraordinary curved undulations, which are very beautiful close to, but equally from far off. They flow downwards from the hood in the most natural way, severely abstract, but easy to read from a distance. And the tones, once again, it's the difference between what you see close to and what you see far off. The tones change as you get closer. And the minbar, very small, but again, a meticulous piece of craftsmanship with mother-of-pearl decoration on rare woods, I think sandalwood and ebony. Very small, but a perfect little bijou piece of craftsmanship. So much then for the components of the mosque. Let me move on to ornament. The carpet. Once again, it reflects the designs of the ceiling above it in a series of medallions in stunning colors. This green is particularly striking, but so the blues and the reds. The largest roundel is under the main dome. And this was, in its time, and it may still be, the largest of all carpets ever made, taking the combined inhabitants of 3 villages in Khorasan to weave it by hand. It's not machine made, and woven in long strips and then sewn together. An extraordinary achievement. On the sanctuary walls, this is a close-up of some of the decoration you've seen at a distance. The idea of the constantly repeating figure 5, the Turkish-style tile work, and the Indian intarsia work, Mughal work in its origins, and the techniques of craftsmanship are still those of the 17th century, with hard stones, semi-precious stones, inlaid into the marble in the technique known as pietra dura. Tile work on larger panels, again, takes up Turkish themes with these vases giving rise to supernatural plants, the blossoms stuffed with flowers, different leaves coming out of the same plant, serrated leaves, these high-necked or high-bottomed jugs, and the capitals, yet another innovation. An innovation that brings to mind the papyrus capitals of ancient Egypt. And just as the papyrus capitals of Egyptian architecture derive from a local plant form, so too do these, the very basic tree of this part of the world, the palm tree. Why did no one have that idea before? Why did no one have the idea of executing it in this heavy style with gilt on squat columns? It works extraordinarily well. They exploit the very ancient idea of the column as a tree trunk, which then bursts into flower exactly where you would expect the living tree to burst into flower. This time, it's the Arabian tree par excellence. And the color even recalls the color of certain varieties of fresh dates. And when you look at it close to, you see this composition of overlapping prismatic lozenges and the fronds of a palm tree. These are a remarkable innovation. Let me finally move to landscaping. I won't have much to say here. But if there's one thing that needs to be said about this mosque, it is that it is a vision in white. And white means something in Islamic civilization. White is the color of Friday. Black is the color of Saturday. In Nizami's Haft Peykar, the great Persian mystical poem, there are 7 cycles of stories, one for each day of the week, and each of them carries a gradually ascending moral message. And it ends on a Friday with the color white. So the use of white in this building is not an accident. It's about purity, and as a bonus, it's a perfect foil for the blue of the sky, the green of the surrounding landscape. And you'll see that that landscaping includes the palm tree, so that living palm trees correspond to their petrified simulacra in the mosque itself. Is it a pun? Who cares? Certainly the living and the stone enrich each other. You have exactly the same thing 1,000 years earlier in the great mosque of Cordoba, where a hall of mirrors of the largest covered space in the Islamic world is matched by a courtyard of lemon and orange trees with channels of water in between. The living forest on one side, the petrified one on the other. So it's an old idea. And here, in this very picture, you can see the importance of choosing a site that had not been built on before. Because you couldn't have had this landscaping, which is still not complete, if it had been sited closer to the city. And let me say one last thing of this landscaping, that to experience it on the way to the mosque or on the way out of the mosque is much more than having a stroll in the park. It has spiritual resonances. 22 separate occasions in the Quran, there are references to gardens beneath which rivers flow. What is promised to the blessed in paradise, if not beautiful buildings, beautiful trees, shady trees, greenery, water, exactly what you see here. Time to end. Let me attempt a summary. This is a modern mosque, It's made of concrete, machine-cut marble for the most part, full of glass, full of lighting. But it's also a traditional mosque, and running right through it is the unspoken sound of the Quran being recited in the inscriptions that you see within the domes inside. It functions as a site of corporate spirituality for this nation, to be used at times of crisis for the great Eids, to be used for state receptions, state visits. The visibility of the ruler. It's a multifunctional place. It has a library, it has teaching, it has tourism, it has the tomb of Sheikh Zayed himself. And it's eclectic, it's ecumenical, it's pan-Islamic. Muslims from all over the Muslim world will recognize some of their local architecture right here. So it's a symbol of the unity of the Muslim Ummah through its art. So it's multivalent. It speaks with many voices. It serves not just Abu Dhabi, but the Islamic world itself. It evokes the heritage of the Islamic past and aspirations for an Islamic future. Thank you.
Looking at the window behind you, we see a minaret with green neon lighting on it. So maybe a three-part question. What is the significance of the color green? What is your opinion of the use of neon, a very modern, very kind of harsh lighting, and then maybe compare it to the Grand Mosque and its use of lighting, particularly on the domes, which doesn't use green and uses much more subtle lighting scheme?
This is done with a big budget. That's done with a small budget. Green, because green was the Prophet's favorite color, according to several hadith. What do I think of it? I think it's ugly, but it's a modern version of a very old Islamic idea, that at the end of Ramadan, minarets were hung with lanterns, and as I said in the body of the lecture, the use of the minaret as a directional symbol. But it's more than that. It's also a symbol of Islam. Maybe you don't need one in Abu Dhabi where everyone's a Muslim, or lots of people, most people are Muslim. But in other parts of the Islamic world, the minaret had a very important role to play as a beacon for the Muslim community, a symbol for Islam in a society that was not entirely Islamic. And that green is just a reminder of it. The green makes it Islamic, but the light is the important thing, rather than the color green. It's a reference also to the Surah of Light, Surah 24, and the 35th verse, which is about God's word being a light in the heavens. And that's often applied to a mihrab.
Sorry, I am Faye. Thank you. That was very nice. I apologize. I missed the first 10 minutes. I heard that the marble open court is designed with a technology where the worshipper will be always cool. I mean, like the flooring will not be season hot, during mid of the day. That's one thing. And I also heard that the chandelier is in the Guinness record as the largest or most precious.
I am happy to believe you.
Yeah.
But to speak of the courtyard, don't believe it. Go out there at midday yourself and see whether you're warm or not.
Well,
I've spent several days at midday in the mosque, and it's very painful to be in the courtyard at that time.
Wow. Okay.
So don't believe in technology.
Okay.
There's no Vorsprung durch Technik.
I just spent 2 years in Turkey, and looking at this from a distance, it reminds me so much of Hagia Sophia. And was there an intentional attempt to model after Hagia Sophia?
I don't think so. I'm not sure where this notion of three domes came from. The closest parallel is actually in Delhi, in the Jummah Masjid there, which is a 17th century mosque. And that actually has three big domes along the sanctuary roof. And there are several other Indian mosques which have that formula. Hagia Sophia does not have that formula. It has a single dome, and so do all the major Ottoman mosques that depend upon it. A single dome, which then breaks up into half domes and quarter domes, cascading down into the floor. So that's a single unified space. This building does not have a single unified space. It has a succession of spaces which you must experience in sequence. So that's an interesting aspect of the sanctuary. You're very aware of it, that at one stage the roof is there, then the next the roof is up there, then it's down again, then it's up again. So it's a different concept of space, but certainly not based on Turkey. If it's based on anything, and I'm not sure that it is, it may be an idea of the designer. If it's based on anything, the closest parallel is in 17th century India. But as I say, one of the strengths of this mosque is that it looks critically and observantly at a number of different Islamic traditions and tries to bring them into a whole.
What is exactly Islamic architect? How can we define? For example, dome. In White House, we have also a dome.
Give me a break. How do I define Islamic architecture? The architecture of the Muslim world. Without wishing to seem in the least bit rude to you, I'm not at all interested in the long arguments about what we should call the architecture or the art produced by people who are Muslims. 100 years ago, it was called Saracenic, Moorish, Muhammadan. How do you like that? Islamic, and even now, there's Islamic and Islamic. And the second one is more religious than the first one. There's Islamicate. None of these terms fit very well, but this is a world that stretches from Morocco to Indonesia. So I think the search for a correct term is a fruitless one. Islamic more or less does it for me, but I wouldn't go to the stake for that definition.
Thank you for your lecture. It's very, very, very interesting. You mentioned the state mosque, but you did not mention the two most important mosques, the ones of Mecca and Medina. I think having been to both, of course, and having seen and experienced Sheikh Zayed Mosque, there is a same feeling, a sense of serenity that a large mosque of this scale would give. I felt it in other mosques around the world as well, not necessarily state mosques, but I'd like your comment on Mecca and Medina in relation to Sheikh Zayed Mosque, if that's possible, please.
Well, I'm a Christian, not a Muslim, so I will never go to Mecca and Medina, to my sorrow. And I don't think it's an accident, something that I didn't say, that this is the third largest mosque in the world after Mecca and Medina. So I think the issue of size is exactly as you've said it, that with very large size, if that size is properly orchestrated, properly stage managed, properly designed, you get a feeling that you can't get in a small space. And I'm sure that is an abiding characteristic of our mosque. Mecca and Medina have had an extraordinarily checkered history. Al-Azraqi describes the various stages of the evolution of both of those mosques. And there was scarcely a caliph who didn't add to their fabric. But in the early 16th century, they fell into the hands of Suleiman the Not So Magnificent. And he took on the title of Guardian of Al-Haramain. And he saw it as his duty to rework them, to refashion them. And as a result, one can't be sure of this because there are no excavations on either site, but as a result of this, what you see, with some tiny exceptions that date back to Kite Bey, the last of the great Mamluk sultans in the late 15th century, with the exception of a couple of details from his period, we're looking at an Ottoman building, and even a late Ottoman building, because Sultan Suleiman was not the first Ottoman to rework the two great shrines. So they have an absolutely central importance for all Muslims, to do with the Hajj, to do with tradition, to do with history. And there's no chance of them being removed from that pole position. But for the history of architecture, they're not nearly as interesting as they should be, because no one could leave them alone. So from what I can see from modern photographs taken in the last 20 years, these are largely modern mosques. So it becomes a matter of archaeology to work out what they looked like 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,400 years ago, so on.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, poor man.
I know that there are more questions, but I hope that Professor Hillenbrand is willing to address them in the room next door, where we have some refreshments. Also, I'd like to point out to you that there in the other room here, there is some display of the Sheikh Zayed Mosque Center. You will see some books that you can look at and give an impression of the cultural interest of that center. And finally, I would like to thank you for your presence, and Professor Hillenbrand for his extremely powerful eloquence, precision, his learnedness, his knowledge, that to me are a monument of architecture in and for itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you.